The harsh reality of racial bias, even against powerful and accomplished individuals, reveals itself in moments that are both shocking and disheartening. Moments that underline how deeply ingrained prejudice can be in the fabric of society. When a black billionaire, a person who has reached the pinnacle of financial success, walks into his own company only to be told to leave, it highlights a painful truth. Wealth, power, and influence do not make one immune to discrimination. This moment illustrates how racial bias operates not only in everyday interactions, but also in spaces that should recognize merit, ownership, and achievement above all else. The scenario forces us to confront the fact that prejudice often overrides reason and logic, with people making assumptions based not on reality but on the stereotypes that cloud their perception of others. No matter how successful, well-dressed, or commanding an individual may be, their skin color can still subject them to suspicion, doubt, and disrespect, creating an invisible barrier that wealth and prestige alone cannot always dismantle. This instance magnifies the double standard at play in society, where a white billionaire entering his own building would likely be met with respect, deference, or even awe, while a black billionaire is met with scrutiny and disbelief. The disconnect between accomplishment and perception becomes glaring, as if race overshadows everything else, reducing a man who has worked tirelessly to create, and innovate to just another stereotype in the eyes of gatekeepers or employees who should know better. It underscores how racial bias is not limited to overt hostility, but often manifests in subtle, casual, yet deeply damaging interactions that undermine dignity. Being asked to leave his own company sends a humiliating message that no matter how high he climbs, society is quick to remind him of the color of his skin before acknowledging his success. This humiliation is not just personal, but symbolic of a wider systemic issue. A reminder that bias can invalidate years of hard work in a single, careless moment. The harshness of such a reality also lies in the emotional impact it leaves behind. Imagine the frustration of building an empire, putting in years of effort, making strategic decisions, employing thousands of people, contributing to the economy, and yet being treated as though you don't belong in the very space you created. It reveals the fragility of respect in a biased world, where recognition is conditional and can be snatched away based on outward appearance. The sting of being told to leave is not merely about personal pride. It's a confrontation with the fact that success does not erase prejudice, that racial bias lingers in corridors of power, corporate offices, and even within the institutions one owns. The billionaire's wealth may have opened doors to boardrooms, government halls, and elite circles, but bias still attempts to push him out of his own front door. This irony emphasizes how entrenched systemic racism is. Unaffected by individual achievement or financial stature, racial bias, in this context, functions almost like a glass ceiling that continues to exist even after breaking through barriers others thought unbreakable. The billionaire represents a figure who, by traditional measures of success, should be untouchably. Society's ingrained prejudices still find a way to belittle, exclude, and question him. It's as if the world is saying, you may own the building, but you don't own the narrative we have written about you. That narrative, shaped by stereotypes and historical inequality, can erase individuality and replace it with assumptions of inferiority, unfamiliarity, or suspicion. This forces us to question whether progress measured in financial terms truly equates to progress in societal acceptance and equality. Even the presence of black billionaires, in a world historically dominated by white elites, is not enough to dismantle the implicit biases that shape everyday human interactions. The harshness also lies in how normalized these moments can be for people of color. For many, being questioned, doubted, or treated as though they don't belong in certain spaces is a daily experience, even if the stakes are not as dramatic as being ejected from one's own company. What differentiates this scenario is the sheer irony and magnitude of the fact that someone who has achieved what only a handful of people in the entire world have achieved still cannot escape the weight of prejudice. It magnifies the struggle faced by millions of people on a smaller scale. From job interviews to retail encounters, where assumptions dictate treatment, the billionaire becomes a mirror reflecting the everyday injustices faced by countless others who are told in subtle or overt ways that they do not belong. Regardless of their credentials or character, there's also a psychological dimension to this harsh reality. Bias, when confronted so directly, leaves a mark on one's sense of belonging and self. While a billionaire might have the resilience to brush it off publicly, the private sting remains. To be told to leave a company you built is not just insulting. It calls into question one's rightful place in spaces that should feel safest and most validating. It becomes a reminder that no matter how high you climb, you cannot entirely escape the gravity of racial prejudice. This weight is heavier than financial burdens because it attacks identity at its core, reducing a person's achievements to irrelevance in the face of skin color. The disconnect between appearance, perception, and true ownership becomes strikingly clear when a black billionaire walks into his own company and is told to leave, as though his very presence is incongruent with the space he rightfully controls. This moment reveals how society often judges individuals not by their accomplishments or authority, but by surface-level assumptions rooted in race, class, and stereotypes. Ownership in itself is an invisible quality. It is not something that can be worn like a badge or carried in one's pocket. Instead, it must be recognized by others. And when those others allow their perceptions to be clouded by prejudice, even ownership loses its power in the face of What is most unsettling is the way perception can so easily override fact. Despite his legal, financial, and operational control over the company, the billionaire's appearance triggers disbelief and dismissal in those who encounter him. It is as if the narrative society holds in its collective imagination does not include someone like him occupying such a position. And so he is pushed into the role of outsider, even within the walls of his own creation. This disconnect highlights how fragile the link is between reality and recognition. A man may own billions, employ thousands, and lead industries. But if others cannot reconcile that image with the prejudices they have internalized, then he is treated as though none of it is true. It points to the deep-seated problem of representation and visibility, where certain images of success have been historically monopolized by whiteness, wealth, and elitism, leaving little room for people of color to be naturally associated with positions of ultimate authority. The fact that he is told to leave rather than welcomed is not just a personal insult, but a reflection of the collective imagination that still struggles to picture black excellence in its highest forms. This imagination is shaped by centuries of exclusion, where power and ownership were intentionally kept out of the hands of people who looked like him, and the echoes of that exclusion linger in every snap judgment that disregards his rightful place. Dynamic between appearance and perception creates a constant negotiation for those who do not fit society's narrow mold of what authority should look like. For the billionaire, his clothing, demeanor, or even confidence may not be enough to override the immediate bias triggered by his skin color. Where others might walk into a corporate building and be assumed to belong, he must repeatedly assert and prove his place, even in spaces where proof should be unnecessary. This repeated need to validate one's authority strips away the ease that should accompany ownership. Instead of being treated as the unquestionable leader of his company, he is forced into the role of a stranger needing justification, a reversal of power that undermines the very essence of what it means to be in control. Ownership becomes less about unquestioned respect and more about constant reminders, as if the reality of his position cannot exist without him actively reinforcing it. The situation also reveals how deeply appearance influences human behavior. Security guards, receptionists, and employees often operate on visual cues when determining who belongs and who doesn't. A white man in a suit might be immediately associated with leadership, while a black man in the same suit may be subjected to doubt. The disconnect lies in how appearance interacts with expectation. If someone doesn't fit the expectation of ownership, then the perception overrides the truth. This phenomenon exposes a fundamental flaw in the human tendency to equate identity with status, one that leaves little room for those who defy stereotypes. It also shows how institutions inadvertently allow these biases to dictate interactions, as those working within them rely on perception rather than verification, perpetuating a cycle where authority is denied unless it aligns with preconceived image. Clash between perception and reality is not only humiliating, but also symbolic of the broader struggles faced by minorities in leadership roles. When individuals who are underrepresented in positions of power step into those spaces, they often face disbelief, suspicion, or resistance precisely because their presence challenges entrenched notions of who belongs. The billionaire's experience is therefore both personal and political, demonstrating the constant pushback that accompanies attempts to redefine societal expectations. His ownership becomes not just a financial fact, but an act of defiance against a world that struggles to see him as capable of holding it. The disconnect, then, is not simply about misrecognition, but about society's reluctance to update its perception in line with reality. Also points to how ownership is often treated as conditional when it comes to marginalized groups. For some, ownership is absolute and unquestioned. For others, it is fragile, subject to suspicion at every turn. The billionaire's legal rights, contracts, and achievements should be enough to silence doubt, yet they are not. He must continually reassert his authority, as though his ownership is always one step away from being overlooked or denied. This conditionality transforms what should be a position of unquestionable power into a battlefield for legitimacy, where every encounter threatens to strip away recognition. Such a reality forces us to ask whether ownership is truly empowering, if it is constantly undermined by others' refusal to accept it at face value. The disconnect also illuminates the emotional toll of living in such a world. To walk into your own company and be told to leave is not simply an inconvenience, it is an affront to identity, dignity, and belonging. It suggests that no matter what one achieves, there will always be those who refuse to see beyond appearance. This constant disconnect wears down the spirit, creating a tension between what one knows to be true and how others insist on interpreting that truth. The billionaire may know he is the owner, but being denied recognition in such a blatant way destabilizes that knowledge, leaving him in a liminal space where his authority exists on paper but is invisible in practice. This invisibility is particularly cruel because it erases the very essence of his achievement, reducing years of work and success to nothing in the eyes of those who cannot reconcile it with their biases at its core. The disconnect between appearance, perception, and ownership reveals the fragility of human recognition systems. It demonstrates that truth alone is not enough to command respect. It must be filtered through the lens of perception, which is often clouded by prejudice. This reality forces individuals to fight not only for success but also for acknowledgement of that success. A dual burden that, though the resilience required to assert identity and authority in the face of prejudice, is a testament to the strength of those who must continually navigate spaces that doubt or diminish them. When a black billionaire is told to leave his own company, the moment is not just about the insult or the misrecognition, it is about the resilience needed to stand firm in one's truth, despite the weight of bias pressing against it. Resilience in this context is not merely about brushing off discrimination. It is about cultivating an unshakable sense of self-worth that cannot be dismantled by the ignorance or prejudice of others. It is about having the patience to repeatedly prove oneself in environments where proof should be unnecessary, and the determination to maintain composure and dignity in situations designed to undermine it. The act of asserting identity in such hostile or dismissive circumstances requires not only inner strength, but also a profound belief in one's rightful place. Even when others attempt to strip it, aware resilience becomes both a shield and a weapon. It shields the individual from internalizing the harmful messages implied by prejudice, protecting the mind from the corrosive effects of constant doubt. At the same time, it acts as a weapon against the very system of bias, as each act of standing firm in the face of exclusion chips away at the structures that sustain discrimination. For the billionaire, walking back into his company and affirming that he is not a visitor, not an outsider, but the owner, is more than just correcting a mistake. It is a declaration of existence and authority that challenges the narrative others try to impose upon him. This act of resilience reinforces the truth that his identity is not up for debate and that his authority does not require validation from those who fail to see it. The resilience required also extends to the long-term journey that led him to such a position in the first place. To become a billionaire as a black man in a world structured by systemic inequality is already an act of extraordinary perseverance. Every step of the journey likely involved barriers that demanded resilience, stereotypes that questioned his intelligence, systemic structures that limited access to opportunities, and a societal narrative that rarely imagines people who look like him at the highest levels of wealth and influence. By overcoming these obstacles, he has already demonstrated an immense capacity to endure, adapt, and thrive. Yet even at the peak of success, he must draw on that same resilience to withstand moments that would shatter the confidence of many. The insult of being told to leave his own company is not an isolated event, but another chapter in a lifelong story of needing to reaffirm his place in spaces that resist his presence. What makes this resilience particularly profound is that it must coexist with vulnerability. To be told to leave one's own company is humiliating, and resilience does not erase the pain of that humiliation. Instead, it transforms the pain into fuel, converting moments of disrespect into opportunities to reaffirm identity and push forward. Resilience acknowledges the wound, but refuses to let it define the individual. For the billionaire, this means absorbing the sting of being misrecognized and choosing not to let it diminish his sense of self, his vision, or his leadership. It is resilience that allows him to return the next day with the same confidence, the same authority, refusing to let prejudice dictate how he carries himself or how he leads his company. The resilience also requires strategic awareness. It is not only about emotional endurance, but also about knowing how to navigate and respond to prejudice in ways that preserve dignity while asserting authority. A public outburst might satisfy anger in the moment but could be weaponized against him. Instead, resilience equips him with the discipline to correct the situation firmly yet calmly, to turn the tables on bias without compromising his integrity. It requires a deep understanding of the dynamics of perception and the wisdom to respond in ways that both protect his identity and challenge the assumptions of others. This level of resilience is not instinctive. It is cultivated through years of experience, through the constant rehearsal of facing doubt and turning it into an opportunity to educate, correct, and assert. Resilience in the face of prejudice is also collective in its implications. When a billionaire demonstrates strength in such moments, he not only protects his own identity, but also opens the door for others who will follow. His ability to withstand prejudice and assert authority becomes an example for younger generations, who might face similar dismissals or doubts. It shows them that resilience is not about passively accepting injustice, but about actively resisting it through presence, confidence, and persistence. His resilience has ripple effects that extend beyond himself, contributing to the gradual dismantling of the very biases that made the incident possible. Each act of resilience becomes part of a larger legacy of resistance. shaping the cultural and societal narrative. To slowly expand its vision of who belongs in positions of power, the resilience required is also a reminder of the emotional labor disproportionately placed on marginalized individuals. While others can walk into a company they own and be greeted with unquestioned respect, he must prepare for the possibility of being doubted, dismissed, or excluded. This extra labor, the need to steel oneself for prejudice, even in spaces where one should be unquestionably accepted, is exhausting. Yet resilience demands that he not only endure this burden, but also thrive despite it, using it as a source of strength rather than a barrier. This transformation of adversity into resilience is what allows him to remain steadfast in his identity and authority, turning moments of prejudice into reminders of his strength rather than proof of his vulnerability. Resilience, in this context, is not simply an individual trait, but a survival strategy against systemic forces. The billionaire's ability to remain composed and assertive in the face of such blatant disrespect is part of a larger battle against the structures that seek to minimize or erase Black excellence. His resilience is a refusal to be erased, a refusal to allow prejudice to dictate the narrative of his success. It is a constant reaffirmation that he belongs, not because others accept him, but because he has earned and built his place through undeniable achievement. This resilience, therefore, becomes both a personal necessity and a political act, a way of living authentically and powerfully in a world that often refuses to acknowledge the full humanity and capability of people like him. Ultimately, the resilience required to assert identity and authority in the face of prejudice is not just about